For Gerard on SuperTalk Mississippi, streaming everywhere at supertalk.fm. We talked about this in the first hour. Richard Gerald Jordan, 79 years old, is scheduled for execution this afternoon, 6 p.m. at Parchman, convicted of the 1976 kidnapping and murder of Edwina Martyr from Gulfport. He's been on death row now since 1977, making him the state's longest-serving death row inmate. He has been resentenced several times. David Voisin is joining me now. He's an attorney in private practice specializing in death penalty post-conviction litigation in state and federal courts, representing clients around the country, and has served as a resource counsel for attorneys appointed to handle capital cases in Mississippi and the Fifth Circuit. David, it's nice to meet you.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on. And I should add that I also represented Mr. Jordan for about just under 20 years, from around 2001 until about 2018 or 19, that I passed the baton to his current team.
So let's just start with the obvious there. With 49 years
Sure.
on death row, justice delayed like this, is it really justice served? And I know you're advocating against the death penalty for him completely, but for the family of the victims, this has really been a long, excruciating waiting game.
No doubt it has, but it's been, a lot of it's of the state's creation, because he's had so many multiple trials because the state has, not given him a fair trial, and appellate courts have had to reverse what happened and send him back to square one. And in fact, even in one case, he had, in the early 90s, he had pled and accepted a sentence of life without parole. And for a while, he was off of death row. And then the state Supreme Court vacated that plea agreement, saying it was not the law. There was no life without parole sentence in effect at the time. So he was, ready to serve a life sentence back then, and he ended up going back to death row because they sent him back for another sentencing proceeding. But it's been a long, hard road trying to get, a fair trial for him. And, most recently, one of the big things that he's had to do is to try to get, basic expert assistance. He was a highly decorated Vietnam vet, and he had horrible combat experiences, but we were never able to get, the funding that you'd need to have a basic psychological assessment because of, big, post-traumatic stress disorder and a lot of the problems that vets face coming back after that kind of experience. And it's only recently that the U.S. Supreme Court said, you've got to give the defense team, an independent, qualified expert who could do the right kind of evaluation in cases like this. And so that's, I wasn't on the lawyer for him on this last round of appeals, but that's what
Right.
they went back for. So there's always something. There's always been something in his case that
And I think
really
that's the problem,
distracted
though,
from
is that
fairness.
there's always been something. That's the problem,
Yeah.
in my opinion. And I've got a nuanced opinion about the death penalty. I'm not sure it's an effective deterrent, but I think it's a consequence of your action. You talk about the PTSD claims. It was undiagnosed until recently. In fact, I believe a 1976 doctor's report found no clinical evidence of PTSD. So it seems to me like another last-minute stall tactic to delay justice rather than perhaps
They
a
did
valid
not.
defense.
Well, I'm sorry, Scott. They didn't assess for PTSD in '76. They were only looking to see if he was competent to stand trial. And in fact, in 1998, his lawyer, realized that, talking to family members, that Richard suffered a lot, and asked the court, saying, we need an independent expert who could help him with this. And the court said no. And when I was representing him in the first state post-conviction and federal habeas corpus appeals, I asked for an expert and was told no. And so he only got that. He's been asking for this for well over 20 years. It's not, it's not a last minute thing for him. He's been asking for this for over 20 years. So that's
But
the real problem
but he
here.
had, correct me if I'm wrong, he admitted the crime, correct? So that begs the question why a confessed murderer should escape the ultimate penalty when Mississippi law supports execution for a heinous act like he committed.
Mississippi law does not, mandate the death penalty. It means he's eligible for it, and then the jurors decide based on, the facts of the crime, balance, they weigh mitigating factors, and war service has always been considered a profound, strong mitigating factor, and it's high recognized that veterans who have been in combat often struggle. You see high suicide rate and other problems that follow from war service. And Mr. Jordan just never had that opportunity. And in Mississippi, sure, there's a death penalty for heinous murderers, but a lot of people get life sentences after jurors hear or allowed to hear all the facts about the client's background.
And with somebody like Richard Jordan, I believe, according to a study that I found, this has cost Mississippi taxpayers more than $2.5 million to jail someone like Richard Jordan for life without parole. So why should the state citizens burden the costs of this instead of enforcing the actual sentence?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, he is entitled to fair legal process, and you have to balance that up. Well, if they're not giving him, it's not his fault he didn't get the resources he needed. He's been asking for that for over 20 years. So, the state of Mississippi has the blame. And also it costs more to seek the death penalty. If he'd just had a life sentence, he'd still be there and he wouldn't have all the legal proceedings that have been going on. And also you have to take a step back and look at the overall kind of the bigger picture, is that sure, people on death row, some of them are innocent, but some of them have done heinous deeds. But there are lots of murderers who were convicted who were never brought up for the death penalty. Mississippi makes a choice, so it's not always a chance, something that people always get sent to death row, or that the most horrible people always go to death row. It's a choice, and it's used less frequently than ever before. So the costs are really unusual when someone is allowed to be on death row.
We're talking to attorney David Voisin here on SuperTalk Mississippi. David, you've also challenged Mississippi's 3-drug protocol method for this execution. And I believe that you and perhaps other attorneys have claimed it's cruel, but this is a widely used method of execution and legal under the Mississippi Department of Corrections protocols after the last execution in the state in 2022.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm not on this legal team, but there is a challenge to the lethal injection. And the challenge isn't to lethal injection, per se. It's a challenge to Mississippi's outdated outlier procedure. Unlike just about every other state and the federal government that still uses lethal injection, Mississippi uses an unreliable 3-drug protocol that does not guarantee that, Mr. Jordan would be completely unconscious, and so there's an unacceptable risk that he would experience pain. Most states in the federal government have moved away from that kind of 3-drug protocol, and what Mr. Jordan has been asking is for the state to shift to using a 1-drug protocol like most other jurisdictions do.
Is that exaggerating the issue? I don't believe there have been any botched executions documented in the state.
There have been. It's documented that the state has not followed its protocol. What's come up in the lethal injection litigation is that the state does not administer the drugs along the timeline that's in its protocol, and it does not take effective measures to ensure that the prisoner is completely unconscious. They don't do adequate consciousness checks, and I believe it was in the last execution there was no indication that he was moving long after even the final drug was administered, which shows that it wasn't working. It eventually killed the prisoner, but all indications would be that he wasn't completely unconscious like he was supposed to be, and wasn't completely paralyzed like he was supposed to be, and that it wasn't really working. It still killed him, but it wasn't appropriate that way.
And I think a lot of proponents of the death penalty would say that's fine. And obviously there's an Eighth Amendment argument to make, but I believe the Supreme Court upheld similar protocols, 2015 Glossop versus Gross, I believe. So I'm not sure those arguments are valid. David, are you able to stick around for another segment? I'd like to talk to you about the deterrence of the death penalty and whether or not you think it's an effective deterrent. Got
I'm
time
happy
for
to
a
stick
few more
around.
minutes?
Sure.
David Voisin, attorney, here on SuperTalk Mississippi. Scott Sands in for Gerard Gibbert in the Element Wealth Studios, streaming everywhere at supertalk.fm. Great comments coming in as well on the C Spire text line at 601-879-43.fm. I'm Scott Sands in for Gerard Gibbert. We're talking about the scheduled execution today at 6 of Richard Gerald Jordan. David Voisin is an attorney specializing in post-conviction litigation for the death penalty in state and federal courts and represented Richard Jordan for 20 years. David, fascinating conversation. I appreciate your time. Interesting on the C Spire text line, without fail, most of the comments that I'm seeing are in regards to your comment that this method of execution could inflict pain and suffering on Richard Jordan when his victim suffered pain and suffering. Shouldn't that be fair? How do you counter arguments like that when so many of us seek retribution in these heinous crimes?
Well, I think the death is the retribution. I don't think our society has ever, countenanced the infliction of unnecessary pain, or at least not since we gave up some of the tortures that used to happen in the 18th century. I think we've all moved away from that. And I think the goal has always been to, if you're going to execute somebody, to do it in a method that's not going to be gruesome or not needlessly painful. And I think there's been the past 150 years has been like a struggle to try to find more effective, painless ways. People have moved away from hangings. There after a lot of botched electrocutions, people have moved away. That was what the whole point of lethal injection was, to move away from that. And I think the efforts to shift to like nitrogen gas, some people think that'll be better. I doubt that, but I think there's always been as a society, we don't want to just needlessly inflict. It's not about administering pain for the sake of that. It's always been about execution
Perhaps for
as
the
the
victims,
punishment.
for the victims' families, it might be a little bit of that retribution and revenge. And I think that's where, and I talked about this last hour, where I've struggled with my opinions on capital punishment in the past. I certainly am in favor of capital punishment nationally. The number of Americans believing supporting the death penalty has decreased since the 1990s, and certainly the number of Americans who believe that it deters crime has decreased by about 15% since that same period. Morally, it's supposed to be a sin to kill anybody, but I think if I were a family member of a victim of a crime like this, I would certainly want to give them the shot myself, or fire the gun, or pull the lever on the electric chair myself as part of that retribution. While we've got limited time here, David, I wanted to get your thoughts on whether or not the death penalty actually does deter other murders. There's conflicting studies. National Research Council says that there's no proof or disproof to the effect of the death penalty. But an Emory study from 2003 showed that every execution deters about 3 to 18 murders based on nearly 20 years of data.
Yeah, my view is I don't think it deters, much, if any, at all. And I think if you go beyond just the stats of public opinion polls and start to look at what's actually happening on the ground, and you'll see Mississippi is actually moving away from the death penalty. While people might believe in it as an abstract matter, when you get right down to it, is it an effective tool of, criminal justice policy? I think the answer is no. You don't see prosecutors seeking it nearly as much anymore. You don't see jurors returning it as much. If you go on the state public defender website, they've got a spreadsheet of all the death sentences imposed since 1976. And you could see in the 80s and 90s, there were about 10 new death sentences a year in Mississippi. The last 10 years, only 6. And in the last 5 years, only 2 new death sentences. So it's becoming, and even those are generally just in a handful of counties. So if you look at in Mississippi, most counties, they don't really have much of it or a death penalty at all. and it's so rarely used. And I think it's a good time to, to think, why are we doing this at all if it's so expensive? And even when we do it, there are a lot of mistakes. We've had a number of exonerations. Curtis Flowers, Sherwood Brown, Eddie Lee Howard, Kennedy Brewer, just to name a few of the more recent ones from death
But
row.
Richard Jordan
So
has admitted
why
the
are we doing
crime.
it?
Richard
Richard
Jordan,
Jordan
though,
has admitted
the crime.
He has
And,
admitted the
and,
crime.
and 49
He's
years
been
on death row is
remorseful.
not the immediate service of justice.
No, but he's served his time. He's served his punishment, and he's been always remorseful, and he's never had a fair opportunity uh, to present his full case to a jury.
Got about 30 seconds here, David, and I appreciate your time. Governor Reeves has said that the execution will move forward today. Is the defense team holding out any last-minute hope?
I think there are two petitions with the U.S. Supreme Court, one challenging an ex post facto challenge to his conviction and death sentence, and a lethal injection appeal. And so we're still waiting to hear from that.
Attorney David Voisin, who represented Richard Jordan for 20 years. Thank you for your time. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Fox News and Super Talk Mississippi News coming up at the top of the hour. I'm Scott Sands in for Gerard Gibbert.